as Dr. Dale mentioned, so the talk today is based on my recent book, The Making of Japanese Settler Colonialism. So please allow me to share my screen with you to start the presentation. I would like to divide this talk into two parts. I want to plan to use the first part to elaborate the second chapter of the book, and then use the second part to explain the book more generally. So I chose the second chapter of the book because its main story is based in San Francisco. So it was also closely tied to an important history of this city, which is the Chinese exclusion. Perhaps for most of us, it is not an unfamiliar topic, as there has been many illuminating, fascinating studies on this theme already from different perspectives. The study I'm presenting today takes a different angle. I will not discuss the history of the Chinese exclusion in the US per se, but will focus on the Japanese perception of it. More specifically, I want to explain how the Japanese views on the Chinese migration to the US and the exclusion propelled Japan's expansion in Latin America and the South Seas at the end of the 19th century. So I want to begin with this image. It appears in a guidebook for Japanese migration to the US, authored by Muto Sanji, a son of a Japanese landlord who later became a business tycoon. As a well-known educated young man in Meiji Japan, he visited Hawaii and mainland US in 1885 and authored this guidebook upon the completion of his trip. This picture is titled The Conflict of Races, right? As the title indicated, Muto believed that the ultimate theme of the contemporary world was a conflict between races. And in his imagination, there were three major players in this conflict: the Anglo-Saxons, the Japanese, and the Chinese. Based on his observation in Hawaii and the American West, Muto predicted that the three races were destined to compete with each other for the leadership of the world in the 20th century. Like many Japanese elites of the day, Muto's definition of a race was derived from Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. Influenced by the global expansion of modern imperialism, Muto and his contemporaries were convinced that the world of mankind, like that of nature, not only was composed of biologically different races, but also followed the same principle of the nature, namely survival of the fittest. The contemporary competition among nations, they believed, was a reflection of the biological struggle for the limited space and resource among races. Muto's view of the world was echoed by a diverse cohort of Japanese elites who traveled across the Pacific Ocean to North America in the last 2 decades of the 19th century as diplomats, students, as well as political exiles. Based on their observation, they saw both the Anglo-Saxon settler colonialism and Chinese migration as critical references for Japan's project of nation building and empire making. Most of these Japanese sojourners and travelers had strong ambitions in the home archipelago, so they closely connected with the political debates in Tokyo by writing letters, travel and migration guides, as well as newspaper articles for their domestic readers. On the one hand, the Japanese elites who visited the American West in the 1880s and 90s usually saw Anglo-Saxon settler colonialism in North America as a living example for Japan's own process of nation building. The Japanese thinker Nagasawa Beten, who studied at Stanford University at that time, argued that the Japanese should adopt the Mayflower settlers' frontier spirit in order to establish a prosperous and mighty nation, much like the United States. On the other hand, Anglo-Saxon settler colonialism was not the only reference for the Japanese intellectuals. The omnipresence of the Chinese immigrants in San Francisco led the Japanese expansionists to include the Chinese model as another point of reference. It is true that the Japanese immigrants at times replicated white racism towards the Chinese in the American West. To combat white racism, they strove to prove their own whiteness and spared no effort to separate themselves from the uncivilized Chinese laborers. This attitude, however, only constituted one aspect of the Japanese settlers' complicated feelings about their Chinese counterparts in the late 19th century. Arriving in American West decades earlier than the Japanese, the Chinese immigrants founded the earliest Asian communities that the first Japanese immigrants readily resided in. While the Japanese elites felt insulted when they were mistaken for Chinese, they also admired the Chinese achievement in the US society. Mutou Sangji, in his book, argued that in a destined global competition between the white and the yellow, the Chinese had offered a good example for the Japanese on how to compete with the Anglo-Saxons. Mutou's book went into details to illustrate the contributions that the Chinese immigrants had made to the American society in the field of agriculture, mining, railway building, manufacturing, etc. He also commented on the strong presence of Chinese communities on the west coast of North America. No matter where he traveled, be it in California, Oregon, Washington, or British Columbia, he could always find the Chinese communities there. Admiring the quote unquote, the courage of the Chinese in competing with the white people, Mutou believed that the Japanese should borrow a page from the successful Chinese experience. In addition, the Japanese settlers in the US also saw the Chinese as competitors. Their imagined racial competition of the world included not only a Japanese white rivalry, but also a battle between the Chinese and the Japanese for the leadership of the yellow. They spared no effort to emphasize the differences between the Japanese and the Chinese, particularly when they sensed that the Japanese would be beginning to experience the same discrimination as the Chinese in the United States. Nagasawa Beiten, for example, spared no effort in emphasizing the superiority of the Japanese to the degraded Chinese. The Chinese, he contended, were the slaves of money, respecting nothing more than profits. The Japanese, however, could not be more different, as he argued, except a small number of Japanese immigrants who had shameful behaviors such as indulging in alcohol, frequenting brothels, and gambling. Others were decent people, making progress in their study and business and earning respect from white Americans. In order to maintain such a progressive image of the Japanese race, Nagasawa further urged Tokyo to pay close attention to the quality of Japanese immigrants and to issue passports selectively. Otherwise, he warned, it might lead to the Exclusion Acts against the Japanese in the US, just like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which would become a national shame for the empire. To reinforce the hierarchy and difference between the Japanese and the Chinese, Nagasawa penned a series of essays for Japanese readers titled The Street of Monsters in San Francisco, depicting the uncivilized and backward lives of the Chinese immigrants in San Francisco's Chinatown, a life filled with prostitution, gambling, superstition, dirty food, and murder. He defined the Chinese as a race of degradation against the human progress that the Japanese had nothing to associate with. But even so, Nagasawa still acknowledged the wide-reaching presence of Chinese migrants around the world and saw the Chinese as a critical rival of the Japanese in their course of empire building. So in the summary, although Japanese elites who traveled and sojourned in North America shared a discriminatory attitude towards the Chinese immigrants in the US, they also described the Chinese with admiration and fear. And this mixed attitude was also shaped by the general perception of the Qing Empire among Japanese intellectuals before the Sino-Japanese War. Japanese elites considered the Qing a mighty geopolitical power in Asia, declining but still maintaining a strong potential for revival. They saw Qing as a rival of Japan in the age of expansion, as well as a possible ally in their racial struggle against the Anglo-Saxons. The first Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted in the US in 1882, before most of the Japanese had arrived in California. It was renewed for another 10 years in 1892 and then became permanent in 1902. The complexity of the Japanese racial identity in relation to the Chinese and the white Americans resulted in different responses among the Meiji expansionists on both sides of the Pacific to Chinese exclusion. Some unconditionally accepted the logic of the exclusion and believed that the uncivilized Chinese deserved it, at the same time emphasizing that the Japanese were a civilized people and therefore would not meet the same fate as the Chinese. Others, however, contemplated the fate of the Chinese in the United States with a measure of apathy. They identified the Qing Empire and the Empire of Japan as two leaders of East Asia, both of whom had to face Western invasion. Even the Qing, with its vast territory, great wealth, and over 300 million people, could not avoid falling prey to Western imperialism. They reasoned the same Western powers would not spare Japan from its imperialistic clutch. They went on to argue that Japan should develop its material wealth and survive through self-defense instead of worshiping the Western nations. Some were further convinced by a series of anti-Japanese incidents in California that the Japanese would eventually meet the same fate of racial exclusion as the Chinese had. The Japanese diplomats in the United States began to send Tokyo copies of articles in local newspapers that called for excluding Japanese because they had no difference from the uncivilized Chinese who stole jobs from white workers. In response, Japanese elites in San Francisco launched attacks on anti-Chinese and anti-Japanese racism in the US together. They also urged the Japanese government to send Imperial Navy to defeat the white Americans in retaliation against such humiliations. Tokyo, however, had little interest in waging an actual war against the US. Nevertheless, many Japanese expansionists in San Francisco and in Japanese archipelago did agree with each other by understanding the Chinese exclusion as an announcement that the Anglo-Saxons had secured their ownership of the North American land and thus had the right to exclude others. The Japanese should follow the example of the Anglo-Saxons by making haste to occupy hitherto unmarked and unknown territories in the world. Once they staked their claim of ownership, they could exclude others, just like the white Americans were now doing. Of course, in the mind of this Meiji expansionist, only the civilized, quote unquote, civilized races qualified as competitors for land ownership. Aboriginal peoples such as Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, as well as the Ainu in Hokkaido, were classified as uncivilized people who had no right to their ancestral lands. An article in 1890 vividly captured this moment of change in Japanese expansionism, authored by political journalist Tokutomi Soho. It was titled "The New Homes of the Japanese Race." Tokutomi began by reaffirming the importance of race in the global politics. Nations no longer competed through military aggression, but through race-centered colonial expansion. He argued the Chinese were an example of a race that had spread to every corner of the world. While the Chinese migrant status in the host societies was usually low, they nevertheless added to the overall strength of the Chinese race. As a result, even though the Qing Empire was declining, Tokutomi claimed the power of the Chinese race was actually increasing because the Chinese continued to migrate overseas and increase in number there. Tokutomi's call to emulate the Chinese in the quest for Japanese expansion was grounded in a discourse that I called Malthusian expansionism. I will explain this concept more closely in the latter part of this talk. But for now, please simply keep in mind that Tokutomi believed that the Japanese, like the civilized Westerners, were an expanding race marked by a rapidly growing population. The Japanese Empire urgently needed to join the global racial competition by exporting its surplus population overseas and turning them into trailblazers of the national expansion. Where then could the Japanese expand to? He named the Philippines, Mariana Islands, and Caroline Islands, and many other islands dotted around the Pacific Ocean as the ideal target. Tokutomi was not bothered by the actual fact that the majority of these areas were already colonized by European powers. He imagined that the white European had failed to claim their ownership over many of these areas because the land was left empty and unused. Aside from the tropical flora and fauna, these islands were inhabited only by primitive barbarians. Once the Japanese actually claimed these so-called empty houses, Tokutomi argued, they could shut the door on everybody else. As a direct result of the Chinese exclusion in the US, the call for southward expansion also garnered supporters inside the Japanese government. A noteworthy supporter was Enomoto Takeaki, whose many roles in the government included a stint as Minister of Foreign Affairs between 1891 and 1892, a time when the flood of a consular report about anti-Japanese campaigns in California began to reach Tokyo. Responding to white racism on the other side of the Pacific, Enomoto established the Bureau of Immigration as a part of his ministry in 1891 to explore the so-called unclaimed land around the Pacific as alternative target for Japanese expansion. In the 1880s and 90s, he played a crucial role in founding the two schools of thought that together constituted the overall discourse of southward expansion in Japan, namely the expansion to South Seas and the expansion to Latin America. Tokutomi's proposal was a part of the intellectual trend that pointed to the South Seas as the future of Japanese expansion. This school of thought emerged after Enomoto Takeaki sponsored a group of Japanese journalists and thinkers to tour around the South Seas via ships of the Japanese Navy. The earliest promoter was a writer named Sugiura Juko. He lamented that the Chinese migrants in North America were humiliated and excluded by the Anglo-Saxons, worrying that the Japanese migrants would eventually receive the same mistreatment in the world of the white settlers. He believed that the Japanese should look elsewhere to expand. According to him, the Qing Empire and Korea were to be Japan's allies. Southeast Asia was already claimed by the British and French. Therefore, the only possible places where the Japanese could build colonies were the numerous islands located to the south of the Japanese archipelago in the Pacific. Another advocate for the expansion to the South Seas was Shiga Shigetaka, who penned a book titled Nanyo Jiji, or the Report of Nanyo. He singled out Hawaii, a wealthy nation that already had thousands of Japanese migrants, as a target worthy of Tokyo's attention. Though Hawaii was officially independent, he argued, the land and the politics of the kingdom were monopolized by white settlers, while its small business and farming sectors were controlled by the Chinese. Shiga argued that the Japanese should also claim a share of the prize by sending more migrants to Hawaii and enhancing Japan's commercial power there. After the US settlers overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy and replaced it with a republic, the Japanese settler elites in San Francisco feared that Hawaii might soon entirely fall into the hand of the white Americans. Therefore, they dispatched 4 people to Hawaii, trying to retain the Japanese residents' voting right. They published a book titled Japan and Hawaii in Tokyo that recorded their observations and thoughts in the island. The book urged the Japanese government to seize the golden chance of the political upheaval on the islands and use forceful diplomacy backed up by Navy power to win political rights for the Japanese settlers there. Given the political geopolitical significance of the island, Japan had to secure its interests there in order to fight the race war against the West. In addition to arguing for Tokyo to exert political pressure, the book also suggested that the Japanese government should follow the model of the Chinese immigrant companies in San Francisco by purchasing land on the islands and cultivate Japanese enterprises there. Nagasawa Beten also published a book around this time titled The Yankees. Echoing this opinion, he emphasized the importance of Hawaii in the racial battle that loomed over the Pacific Ocean. He further pointed out another advantage that would come from controlling Hawaii by the Japanese. The island would serve as a strategic station for the Japanese Empire in the middle of the Pacific, allowing it to further expand to Latin America. The Yankee also served as a telling example of how the discourse of Japanese colonial expansion to the South Seas was closely tied to the discourse of Japanese expansion to Latin America. Much like the case of the South Seas, the promotion of expansion to Mexico and further south in the Western Hemisphere was a collective response made by the Japanese expansionists in Tokyo and San Francisco to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States, which they viewed as an episode in the colonial contest between different races. Substantial efforts in promoting migration to Latin America began when Enomoto Takeaki became Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1891. In the same year, Enomoto established a Japanese consulate in Mexico City, collecting local information to facilitate migration planning. He assigned Fujita Toshiro to head the consulate in Mexico. Fujita previously served as Japanese consul in San Francisco, whose letters had flooded Enomoto's office in Kasumigaseki, reporting anti-Chinese campaigns and warning about the possible Japanese exclusion in California. Later that year, Enomoto sponsored Fujita to conduct a trip with a few other government employees to investigate locations in Mexico suitable for Japanese migration. This was a map of Mexico that was included in the report written by Fujita after his investigation. Enomoto's initiative was echoed by the discussion about the expansion into Latin America among the Japanese travelers and settlers in San Francisco. Disillusioned by white racism, some of them gave up the dream of pursuing Japanese colonial future in American West. The real promised land for the Japanese, they believed, existed to the south of the US border. Latin America had a vast and fertile land, and its natives were nothing like the white Americans. They were welcoming and obedient. The Japanese elites also began to publish reports of self-organized Japanese American expeditions to Mexico and South America around this time. And in this Trans-Pacific chorus clamoring for Japanese migration to Latin America, the Chinese migrants, the actual victim of racial exclusion in the US, also played a role, as it had done in the case of Japanese migration to the American West. Japanese expansionists used the Chinese experience in Mexico as a reference point to make their own proposals. In fact, it was the Chinese presence in Mexico that encouraged the Japanese expansionists to view Mexico as a colonial target in the first place. To promote expansion to Mexico and further south, Nagasawa Beten argued in 1893 that the Chinese, being excluded from North America, Hawaii, and Australia, were now moving into Mexico and South America. In order to avoid ceding these lands to the Chinese control, the Japanese should occupy them first. In summary, I have therefore argued that the Chinese migration and its exclusion from the US served as both a reference and a stimulation for the rise of Japanese expansion in Latin America in the final 2 decades of the 19th century, as well as the South Seas. I showed how white racism against the Chinese the Chinese and Japanese immigrants and the inter-ethnic relations between the Chinese and Japanese in the US jointly propelled Japanese expansion to the South Seas and Latin America. And as I mentioned before, so this research is based on the 2nd chapter of the book I recently published, which is titled The Making of Japanese Settler Colonialism, Malthusianism, and Trans-Pacific Migration. And in the remaining time of this talk, so please allow me to briefly explain some of the overall argument of the book itself. And throughout the history of the Japanese Empire, the need for extra space to accommodate the archipelago's rapidly growing population was a common reason used to legitimize migration-based overseas expansion. And my book examines the entire history of this discourse and explains how it empowered and entwined with the expansion of the Japanese colonial empire. As mentioned when explaining Tokutomi's call for Japan's southward expansion, I define this type of overpopulation discourse as Malthusian expansionism. And this is a set of ideas that demanded for extra land abroad to accommodate the claimed surplus population or surplus people in the domestic society on the one hand, and emphasize the necessity of the overall population growth and of the nation on the other hand. As 2 sides of the same coin, and these seemingly contradictory ideas work together in the logic of Malthusian expansionism. It rationalized migration-driven expansion, which I call Malthusian expansion, as both a solution to domestic social tensions supposedly caused by overpopulation and a means to leave the much needed space and resources in the homeland so that the population of the nation could continue to increase. And examining the history of Malthusian expansionism allows me to revise the understanding of the Japanese empire in three ways. And first, I'm able to illustrate the ideological and institutional continuities centered around the overpopulation discourse that persisted through different periods of the Japanese emigration. The history of Japan's Malthusian expansion transcended both space and time of the Japanese empire. And so for your reference, here is the table of content of my book. And each chapter actually discuss a connected but also independent kind of a topic situated in a distinct geographical location. So I trace the origin of Japanese Malthusian expansion to the beginning of the Meiji era. And I explained how the migration of D-class samurai to Hokkaido in early Meiji was a precursor to the ideas and practices of Japanese migration to North America and other parts of the Pacific Rim in the following years. Likewise, Japanese migration to the US that began in the last 2 decades of the 19th century also provided crucial languages and resources for the following waves of Japanese migration to South America and Northeast Asia from the early 20th century to the end of World War II. I also extended the analysis into the post-war era and see the Japanese migration to South America in the 1950s and 60s as the final episode of the history of Japan's Malthusian expansion. Though no longer performed by an expanding empire, the post-war migration from Japan was still legitimized by the same discourse of overpopulation and while driven by the same institutions and networks that were established before 1945. Second, the concept of Malthusian expansionism allows me to look at Japanese migration across the Pacific through the lens of settler colonialism. As my book has explained, Japanese expansionists saw the Japanese migrants in the US, both laborers on the West Coast and rice farmers in Texas, as Japan's equivalents to the Anglo-American colonial settlers. From this perspective, Japanese immigrants' struggle for inclusion in the US citizenry was a crucial step for the Japanese to secure the membership of white man's club. Though this was eventually denied to them by the Immigration Act of 1924, between the late 19th century and the early 20th century, advocates for Japanese migration to the US had no intention of challenging the US settler colonial structure itself. Instead, they saw the Japanese American immigration as an intrinsic part of the Japanese empire's participation in the colonial order in the Americas and other parts of the world. Finally, Malthusian expansionism also allows me to see the Japanese empire as an integrated part of the history of settler colonialism in the modern world. And to put it differently, Japan was not an anomaly in the world history. As my book has explained, the empire builders of modern Japan did not invent Malthusian expansionism. Instead, this set of ideas were created by the British expansionists during the 17th and 18th century to justify the colonial settlers' appropriation of aboriginal lands in North America. In fact, the emergence of Malthusian expansionism, a powerful discourse that legitimized the acquisition of foreign land in the language of reason and progress, marked the birth of the modern settler colonialism itself. While it was the first exemplified by the British settler colonialism in North America, and then by the US westward expansion, Malthusian expansionism was later also adopted by other modern empires to justify their own expansion in the 19th and 20th century. The chorus of Axis powers' demand for living space in the early 20th century was by no means an anomaly in a civilized world. Their intellectual roots can be dated to the genesis of the modern world itself, when the imperial nations in Europe redraw the world map through the lens of enlightenment. So this is the end of my talk, and thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to the questions you may have.